Chapter 6. Grandpere lowered the iron.
"What the devil are you doing here, Joe?"
It was a moment or two before Joe could catch his breath.
"They're coming," he said. "Soldiers! They're coming this way. They're searching all the houses." "You sure?" said Grandpere, going to the window.
"I'm sure," Joe said.
"Well," said Widow Horcata, "you told us it would happen, Henry, and it has. And it's what we've planned for, isn't it?" "You'll be all right, will you?" Grandpere said, pulling on his coat. "Of course we will," she said. "Now get going and be quick about it. Grandpere had the back door open by now. And Henry, don't come back till we come for you. If we don't come, you know the worst, and you'll know what to do." Grandpere made to come back into the room. "No goodbyes," said Widow Horcata, and she waved him away. "Just go." And the door closed behind him. "Come here, Joe," she said, and she took his hand. "How far away are they?" "They were down the road," said Joe. 5 minutes, maybe 10, but they could be going further down the valley to Mugen's place, or maybe they'll be here. Sooner or later they'll be here," said the widow. "We'll plan on sooner. Now, everyone knows you go shopping for me?" Joe nodded. "That's what you come here for then, money for the shopping. Here." She stood up and took a few coins from the mantelpiece. "Take it," she said, "and you'll be eating when they come. Boys are always eating, aren't they? So fetch a plate and a knife and cut yourself some bread. We'll keep it natural. I'll be knitting, you'll be eating." "But what about the children?" asked Joe. "Just you let me do the worrying," she said. "All you've got to do is eat." And Widow Horcata gathered her stitches and busied herself over her knitting. "I've done 10 of these jumpers now," she said, "all sizes." But Joe wasn't thinking of the children anymore. "Why was Grandpere here?" he said. Widow Horcata did not answer. "Does he know all about Benjamin, about Anya and the children?" The widow looked up from her knitting. "I didn't want to tell him," she said. "He guessed most of it, and I had to tell him the rest. He's no fool, your old grandfather. Not an easy man to lie to. Never was. You remember that day you brought him up here? Well, he kept on at me about why I needed the money. He had to know the truth, or he said he wouldn't help me. So I had to tell him." "About me, too?" said Joe. "Everything," she said. "Now look what you've made me do. I've dropped my stitches again." She was still trying to gather them when they heard the snorting of a horse outside and the sound of hooves on the cobbles. "Eat, Joe, eat," whispered Widow Horcata, and Joe stuffed a crust of bread in his mouth and chewed on it. Somehow it helped to control the fear rising in the pit of his stomach. There were voices outside now, a barked command, and then the expected knock on the door. Widow Horcata waited for a few moments, put her knitting in her lap, and composed herself. "Come in," she said, and the door opened. Lieutenant Weissman clicked his heels. He was very tall in the room, his head almost touching the beams. "Pardon, madam," he said, looking around the room, "but we are carrying out searches." "Are you indeed?" said Widow Horcata coldly. "And what is it that you're searching for, may I ask?" The lieutenant smiled. "We shan't know that, madam," he said, "until we find it, shall we?" He ushered a soldier past him and pointed to the staircase. Then he turned his gaze on Joe. "And what are you doing here?" he asked. Joe found he couldn't speak, so he didn't try. "He does my shopping for me, don't you, Joe?" "Ah, yes," said Lieutenant Weissman, studying him hard, and he turned again to the widow. "You live here alone?" "Yes," said Widow Horcata. "My husband was killed in the last war. I am quite alone." "I am sorry, madame," said the lieutenant. "Sorry? And what is it that you're sorry for, Lieutenant? That I'm a widow? That I'm alone? Or that you're searching my house and treating me like a common criminal? Which?" "Entschuldigung, madame," said the lieutenant stiffly, and he called upstairs. "Etwas?" "Nein, Herr Oberlieutenant," said the soldier's boots were heavy on the staircase as he came back down into the kitchen. "And what do you keep in your barn, madame?" said the lieutenant. "Animals," she said, sniffing and wrinkling her nose. "Farmers usually keep animals in barns. It's what they're used for. Before I sold them, I used to keep my pigs in there through the winter. And now? Nothing. Some hay for my cow, that's all. Then you won't mind if we take a look, said Lieutenant Weissman. Lieutenant, she said, let's not play games with each other. You'll search my barn whether I want you to or not. Indeed, madame, but I only meant... Widow Horkata interrupted him. I know what you meant. Do it, Lieutenant. Just do what you have to do and leave us in peace. Auf Wiedersehen, madame, he said, and they left, shutting the door behind them. Joe ran to the window. One of the soldiers was pushing at the barn door. He kicked it, and it flew open. They're going in, said Joe. They'll find them. No, they won't, Joe, said the widow. They won't find anything because there's nothing in there but hay, bracken, and a lot of old pig's muck. Then where are they? Said Joe. Come away from that window, said Widow Horkata, smiling, and you can put my money back before you forget. She took his hand as he passed her. You're a brave boy, Joe. It's a funny thing, you know, but when you're old and used up like I am, and there's only the grave to look forward to, nothing seems to frighten you very much. They heard the barn door shut and the horse moving off. We'll wait for an hour or so, just to be sure, she said. Then we'll go and find them. Where are they? Asked Joe again. You'll find out soon enough, she said. It was a long, silent climb up through the trees. Widow Horkata walked ahead of him, pausing every so often for breath. There must be no talking, she had said, not one word. All the time Joe was trying to guess where the children might be. They were heading towards the plateau. There were several shepherds' huts up there, and some of them would certainly be large enough to house the children. He could not think of anywhere else they might be. Where the mountain met the tree line, the trees grew more sparsely. There was a lot more daylight above them now. Joe looked up. A few spindly trees clung for life to the rock face above him. Widow Horkata stopped and leaned on her stick. She looked about her, listening, her finger to her lips, and then she was bending and pulling aside the undergrowth. Behind the bracken and the brambles was a curtain of sacks. She lifted it and beckoned Joe through after her. Joe ducked down and found himself in darkness. She had him by the wrist and was leading him along what seemed to be a passage, and Joe was groping ahead of him like a blind man. A single light glowed dimly far ahead of him. Then there were several lights that were suddenly bright and flickering as another curtain of sacks parted in front of them. Grandpère was there, holding out his hand to help him in, and Benjamin was beside him. A young girl clung to Benjamin's arm, and Joe saw at once that it was Leah. He wasn't sure she even recognized him at first, but then her eyes lit up. "Joe!" she said, and she took his hand at once as if he belonged to her and led him deeper into the cave. The cave was narrow, low, and long, and dimly lit with guttering lamps hung here and there along the walls. At first glance, it was not always easy to distinguish the children from their own shadows. The place smelt of oil and cheese and meadow hay. Everywhere the floor was covered with bracken, except for a great bed of hay in the darkest corner, where a huddle of children were curled together in sleep. Along a winding track in the bracken came a wooden train propelled towards him by two boys on their knees, one chuffa-chuffing and the other ooh-ooing. Then the wagons came unhitched, and there was an instantaneous quarrel. Benjamin crouched down beside them to make the peace, which was achieved as soon as the train was linked together again. Joe recognized it then as his own train, the battered train of his childhood. He hadn't set eyes on it for years. He looked back at Grandpère, who smiled and shrugged his shoulders. "Didn't think you'd mind," he said. Three girls sat side by side over the same book, the girl in the middle reading aloud to the other two, one of whom turned the page to see for herself what would happen next. The reader snatched her hand back and held on to it for a moment before taking off her glasses and breathing onto them. It was then that she looked up and saw Joe. She froze. Quite suddenly, all of the children had noticed him. "Joe," Leah announced. She was introducing him. "Joe!" The sleeping ones on the hay were nudged into consciousness. Joe felt the stare of each of them. It was more curiosity than hostility, he thought, but there was suspicion enough in those looks to make him feel uncomfortable. "Well, Joe," said Benjamin, "what do you think of it? 3 months I've been up here now. The children and me, we've made ourselves quite snug. We've got running water in the back of the cave. Your grandfather's idea it was. We've got a lot to thank him for. I used to come up here a lot at one time, Grandpere said. My father, your great-grandfather Joe, God rest him, he used to do it a lot of smuggling over the border. Brandy mostly, but everyone was at it those days. And he kept his stuff in here. To tell you the truth, I'd almost forgotten about the place until they showed me that barn full of children. If those soldiers had come looking during the winter, well, it doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Then don't think about it, Henry, said Widow Horcata, lowering herself gingerly onto a wooden bench. No sense in thinking about what could have happened, especially when it didn't. Maybe, maybe not, said Grandpere somewhat tersely. I'm telling you, Alice, today was a warning. I've told you before, we've got to get these children out of here, and soon. I can take them. I know these mountains like the back of my hand. And I've told you before, said Widow Horcata, you've got no patience, never have had. We've got to wait until the time is right. Do you think we want to keep the children here a minute longer than we have to? Do you? Benjamin's ankle may be better and the snow may be gone, but let me tell you, Henry Lalande, you tell me how we're going to take 12 children past those German patrols. You've seen them. They're everywhere. And anyway, there's 2 or 3 children still too weak to make the journey. Grandpere was about to argue. No, Henry. They're safer here. You said yourself no one knows this place except you. We bide our time, like we all agreed. I was up in the mountains again only yesterday, said Benjamin, looking for a way through. 2, maybe 3 times a week I'm up there studying the routes the patrols take, how often they come, when they come. I don't care how well you know them, Henry. You'd never make it. On your own, maybe, if you're lucky, but not with all these children. We've got to wait. That's all we can do. Wait and pray. Someone was tugging Joe's coat. He looked down. A small boy gripped his arm and dragged him away. That's Michael, Benjamin called after him. He wants you to play chess. You won't stand a chance. From his size, Joe thought Michael must be about half his age. Michael fell on his knees in the bracken and set out the pieces on the flat rock that served as a chessboard. The squares were marked out with white chalk. He held out his clenched fists, and Joe knelt down and tapped his right hand. Black. Joe was happy. He always won with black. Joe was good at chess. So good Laurent wouldn't play him anymore, nor would Grandpere. Only Monsieur Audap beat him regularly. Suddenly he was aware of shadows crowding in around him. All the other children were coming to watch. Michael never looked at him once during the game. In between moves he sat with his arms folded, his eyes on the board, and when it was his turn he moved his piece without hesitation and without any apparent thought. After half a dozen moves, Joe just wished it to be over. Every piece he lost provoked a sigh of pleasure from the audience, and when a few minutes later Joe found himself checkmate, Michael looked up for the first time and smiled. Joe saw that when he smiled his ears moved, and he could not help but smile back. You play better than your grandfather, said Michael. I beat him in 10 moves. It was a little enough consolation for Joe as he went back down through the trees with Grandpere later that day. Grandpere was grumbling. She always argues, that woman. Trouble is, she's always right, too, and that only makes it worse. It's true enough what she says. There's patrols out everywhere, along the river, in the woods. Once up the top, you could maybe slip past on a dark night, but between here and there, you'd never do it. Not with the children. There's got to be a way through. There's got to be. Grandpere, said Joe, why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? You've been going up there all this time, and haven't you? Why didn't you tell me? Grandpere stopped and looked at him. Because she told me not to, Joe, and she's right. It's safer not to know. Come to that, I could ask the same of you. You never told me, did you? Same reason, said Joe. Then there you are, said Grandpere, and he smiled. I'm proud of what you've done, Joe, and Maman would be too, but not a word at home, Joe, not even a look. We won't even talk about it at all. Not behind closed doors, not with 100 bleeding sheep around us. I don't want her knowing, Joe. You know how she worries.
They walked on for a bit. "That little boy, that Michael," said Joe, "he said he beat you in 10 moves.
"So he did," said Grandpere, "but he's hardly a little boy. Benjamin says he's nearly 15, same sort of age as you. Nothing much of him, is there? That's what hunger does for you."
The Germans found nothing in the village that day except for a couple of unusable rifles. For some weeks afterwards, there was a frosty enmity between the villagers and the soldiers. Hubert blew his raspberries again, and Laurent put his tongue out at them. When they weren't looking, of course. Even Armand Jolette stopped opening doors for them. But time healed the wound, and everyone was soon back on speaking terms again with the soldiers. There was a greater caution now, and a new understanding, that harmless though they might seem, the soldiers were still the enemy, and when called upon, they would behave like it. Joe avoided all of them now, even the corporal. Every time he saw them, he could not put it out of his mind that these men were hunters. They were hunting down Benjamin and Leah, Michael and the others. Just to look at the soldiers made him feel uncomfortable, so he distanced himself from them. He accepted no sweets and exchanged no civilities. At home, too, Joe felt uncomfortable. He had lived for a long time now with his secret, and up until now had felt no sense of guilt at keeping it from Maman. But now that his secret had become kind of a conspiracy with Grandpere, he found himself acting out a charade. It was hateful for him to have to lie to her, to watch her being constantly and successfully deceived. He found it more and more difficult to look her in the eye, to talk to her even. So he spent all the hours he could out with Rolf and Hubert looking after the sheep. He was sitting on his rock with Hubert one morning when he saw the corporal coming along the road. He had no rifle, only binoculars round his neck. He stopped and smoothed Rolf, who did not discriminate at all. He liked anyone who adored him, Germans included.
"It's Friday," the German announced. "On Fridays I have some hours off duty, and I do not forget my promise."
"Promise?" said Joe.
"The eagle, the binoculars. You don't remember?"
Hubert was inspecting the binoculars closely.
"You want to look, Hubert," said the corporal. "I show you."
And he took off the binoculars and hung them around Hubert's neck. Hubert held them to his eyes and looked out across the valley. The corporal tapped him on the shoulder and pointed upward. A lark hovered there noisily. A moment or two later, Hubert found it in the binoculars, and the corporal focused it for him. Hubert roared with excitement. The corporal laughed and patted him on the back.
"Well, Joe," he said, "do you want to come with me?"
Take Hubert," said Joe, and he looked away.
"As you wish,"
said the corporal quietly, and he turned to Hubert.
"You come with me, Hubert,"
and pointed towards the mountains.
"We look for eagles, yes?"
He held his arms out wide.
"Eagles, high up!"
He made binoculars out of his hands, put them to his eyes, and scanned the mountains.
"Eagles," he said, flapping his arms. "You come."
Hubert looked at Joe and then at the sheep.
"Go on," said Joe. "I'll mind 'em."
Rolf got up to go with them, but Joe held him back. He needed the company. He sat with his thoughts all that morning. He'd been up to the cave several times now with Grandpere and Widow Horkata, carrying oil and food, and each time he'd wondered at Benjamin's seemingly unshakable optimism. The more he thought about it, the more he could see no good reason for it. The days passed, the months passed, and still Anya did not come. If she was alive after all this time, and like Widow Horkata, Joe found that increasingly difficult to believe. Then where was she, and why hadn't she come? He never shared his misgivings with Benjamin, for in Benjamin's few unguarded moments, Joe sensed a fragility in his faith that might not stand the test of reason. And besides, it was easier and more comforting to go along with Benjamin's repeated assurances.
"She'll be hiding up somewhere," he'd said. "Maybe in a barn, maybe in a cave just like ours. She'll come. God willing, she'll come. God looks after his own, Joe. He always does."
Joe hoped hard that he did. News of the war was better. The Germans were being driven back out of Russia and out of Africa. But liberation was still a distant dream, and a dream no one dared to talk of, for fear that it might not happen. Yet Joe could see no other hope for the children or for Benjamin. The patrols were just as frequent and watchful as ever. There always seemed to be some children sick, and Benjamin would not hear of leaving any of them behind.
"We all go or none of us go," he said. "Wait and pray.
Our time will come." Joe would have liked to have made friends with the children in the cave. They all knew who he was by now, but they still treated him like a stranger and hid themselves behind their dark eyes. All except Michael, who never let him leave without beating him at chess. Michael had recently become one of the sick children. He had developed an abscess on his leg and a fever with it, but it didn't stop him wiping Joe off the board every time in under 20 moves. The games were always held in complete silence, a rapt audience all around. Joe still chose black, believing and hoping that one day it would bring him luck, but it never did him any good. Widow Horcata would never let him stay very long after the game, so there was not much time for talking. And when they did, Michael was full of questions about Joe, about his family, about the animals on the farm, about his school. He would say little about himself, only that he could speak 4 languages, Polish, French, German, and a little English. "I want to speak 10, he said, but he never once spoke of his family. Joe asked Widow Horcata where they all were, and she would not tell him. "There are some things better not to think about," she said, and nothing more was said about it. And Grandpère was no more forthcoming. Either they didn't know, or they didn't want to talk about it. Joe was not sure which. But the more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that they did know, and that they were just not telling him. He wondered why. The sun was hot on his head, and Joe felt like lying down. But he'd done that once before, and he would never do it again. He talked to Rolf instead. Some hours later, as he was moving the sheep further down the valley to fresh pastures, he saw the corporal and Hubert walking across the field towards him. Hubert broke into a leaping run, shouting through the sheep as he came. The sheep scattered in all directions, their bells jangling. From the wild gesticulations and excited gruntings, it became clear very quickly that Joe had missed something special. The corporal confirmed it. "It was a big one," he said. "I've never seen an eagle so big. He saw it first, didn't you, Hubert?" Hubert had the binoculars to his eyes and was pointing to the mountains. "And I did not believe him," the corporal went on. "Not at first, because I could not see it. It was not in the air, you see. It was on the ground. Perhaps it had just caught something. Maybe it was a rabbit. And then it took off into the air and we followed it." He laughed. "Hubert would not take the binoculars from his eyes, and he kept tripping over, but we did not lose it. We followed it higher, always higher, until it landed on a shelf of a rock. And there were these twigs there. I saw them. I think it must be a nest, Joe." "Did you see any young birds?" Joe said. The corporal shook his head. "Maybe we go back another day. Next Friday, yes?" "Maybe," said Joe, shrugging his shoulders. He was doing his best to conceal his enthusiasm. "Good," said the corporal. "I shall look forward to it." Even after he had gone, Hubert never stopped flying about like an eagle. As they drove the sheep back into the village that evening, he was still at it, flapping his arms like wings, curling his hands into claws, and shrieking. Joe found himself almost annoyed with Hubert for having enjoyed it so much. Eagle's nest or not, he would not go with the corporal next Friday. He would not. That Sunday after Mass, Joe saw Father Lasai talking earnestly to Grandpère and Lieutenant Weissman outside of the church door. At lunch, Grandpère was unusually quiet. Maman noticed it too. "Is there something the matter?" she said. Grandpère pushed away his plate and lit a cigarette. "That Boshi corporal, the big one," he said. "You know him? Well, he's just about the best of 'em, I'd say." "What about him?" said Maman. "He had 3 daughters, Grandpère said, and now he's got 2. One of them was killed in a bombing raid on Berlin last week." "Poor man," said Maman. "Poor man." Grandpère stood up, angry. "Why poor man, eh? If he'd stayed at home and looked after his family like he should have done, like they all should have done, he'd still have 3 daughters, wouldn't he? And my son, your husband, wouldn't be shut up in some camp. And those children!" He stopped short and coughed. Maman looked at him sharply. "What children?" she asked. But Grandpère pretended not to have heard, and by the time she asked again, he was almost out of the room. "I'm going up to the hut," he said, and he was gone. "Why is Grandpère angry?" asked Christine. "I don't know, dear," said Maman, still frowning after him. "I don't know." The following Friday, the mist was still lying in the valley when the corporal came by as he'd promised he would. Joe half hoped that he wouldn't come, for he knew that he would not be able to refuse him now, and that's how it turned out. The corporal seemed a different man. All the jollity was gone, all the warmth. His eyes were red and vacant. "You are coming, Joe?" he said, and he handed Joe the binoculars. Hubert wanted to come again, but he was quite used to taking turns, and anyway, the half-bar of chocolate the corporal offered seemed a tempting enough substitute. They left him guarding the sheep. When Joe looked back, he was making Rolf lie down and beg for his chocolate. They walked on without speaking. "We won't be able to see much in the mist," said Joe. "Then we get higher, it will be better." It was several minutes before Joe found the courage to speak of it, but he knew he had to. "About what happened to your daughter," he said. "I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry." "Thank you, Joe," said the corporal. "Thank you." And then he started talking, and once he had started, he didn't stop. "If there has to be a war," he said, "that it should be fought between soldiers. Before, it was always between soldiers. That I can understand. I do not like it, but I can understand it. At Verdun, it was one soldier in a uniform against another soldier in another uniform. What have women and the children to do with the fighting of wars? Tell me that. Every day since I hear about my daughter, every day I ask myself many questions, and I try to answer them. It is not so easy. What are we doing here, Wilhelm? I ask myself. Answer, I'm guarding the frontier. Question, why? Answer, to stop people escaping. Question, why do they want to escape? Answer, because they are in fear of their lives. Question, who are these people? Answer, Frenchmen who do not want to be taken to work in Germany, maybe a few prisoners of war escaping, and Jews. Question, who is it that threatens the lives of Jews? Answer, we do. Question, why? Answer, there is no answer. Question, and when they are captured, what happens? Answer, concentration camp. Question, and then? Answer, no answer, because there is no answer, Joe, but because we are frightened to know the answer. He wiped his cheeks with the back of his hand and laughed. You see what happens when you ask so many questions, Joe. When I was little, I always asked too many questions, and my mother would become impatient. When I asked why again and again, she would say, A blue reason, Willie, a blue reason. Joe smiled at that. So, said the corporal, we smile again. We must smile. It is good to smile. Now we look for eagles. As they climbed out of the trees, they left the mist below them and reached a wide plain of spongy grass, dotted with gray-blue thistles and scattered rocks, with a silver stream running through it. It was here, said the corporal. We were here when we saw it the last time. He pointed upwards. Look, can you see there? Up there, halfway up the mountain. How you say it? A ledge, yes. It was up there. I am sure of it. Joe trained the binoculars on the rock face. Higher, a little higher, Joe. Can you see it? And there it was, a wide ledge of rock, a dark recess behind it, and at one end a nest of twigs, but no eagle. She's not there, said Joe, and I can't see a chick. She'll come, said the corporal. If she comes once, then she'll come again. We must be patient. We will move higher up in the mountain. That way we can see better. Joe followed him across the valley, leapt the stream, and scrambled up the shale on hands and feet until they came to a steep slope that was always covered in blueberries in September. Joe had often been up there picking them with Papa. They squatted down the shadow of a great rock. From there they could look back across the narrow valley and into the ledge. The corporal took the binoculars and trained them. Better, he said, much better. Here she will not see us, but we will see her. Now we wait. We wait and pray. Joe looked at him. Something is wrong? Asked the corporal. Joe turned away and shook his head. I know someone else who often says the same thing, said Joe. That's all. Here, said the corporal. You must have the binoculars. Now we must be still. You must be silent. They sat side by side, knees drawn up, eyes scanning the sky about them. They spotted birds by the score, vultures, ravens, larks, buzzards, and a lone red kite that absorbed them for an hour or more, but no eagle. Joe was training the binoculars on a vulture high above him, drawing it into focus until it filled the circle of the glass. He could see the feathers on it, how they wrapped around the wind and kept it floating up there. Suddenly, the corporal's arm was on his shoulder and squeezing him. Joe swung the glasses across the ledge and caught up with the eagle just as she landed. She dropped something at her feet. Joe could not make out what it was. The eagle shook herself and surveyed the world beneath her. Then she picked up her prey. It looked like a marmot, Joe thought, and sidled along the ledge towards the nest. There she dropped it, stood a claw on it, and began to pick at it. It was then that Joe saw something moving in the shadows under the rock behind her. A chick came lurching and hopping over the twigs towards the eagle. "Look!" he whispered. "Look!" "Please," said the corporal, holding out his hand, and Joe handed him the binoculars. "Prima!" "Oskeshiznet," murmured the corporal. "Oskeshiznet. I think there's 2 of them, Joe. Yes, there's 2!" And he handed the binoculars back to Joe. Infuriatingly, it took some time for Joe to find the ledge again and focus, but then he had them, all 3 of them, and he was watching an eagle's tea party of shredded marmot. They pulled at it, all of them, tearing at the same piece and hopping backward until it snapped. Joe felt the corporal tapping him on his arm, but he was so entranced that he was reluctant to hand back the glasses. The tapping became more insistent. Joe lowered the glasses, but made to hand them over. But the corporal didn't seem to want them. He was pointing down to the valley below them. Joe looked. 3 soldiers were moving slowly towards the stream. He could hear their voices now. Joe turned his binoculars on them, but before he could focus, they had moved out of sight behind a large boulder. One by one, they emerged the other side. Joe looked up at the corporal, who shrugged his shoulders and smiled. "It's all right, Joe," he said. "I've got my papers." Joe looked down at them again. Someone was moving through the trees beyond the boulder. Another soldier, Joe thought. He lifted the binoculars a fraction. It was no soldier. As Joe focused the binoculars, his worst fears were realized. Benjamin was crouching now at the edge of the wood. He was looking this way and that, as if he was about to dash out across the open towards the cover of some nearby rocks. And Joe saw with a sickening heart that from where Benjamin was, he could not possibly see the patrol behind the boulder. They only had to walk a few more paces, and he would come face to face with them.